Hello my friends, HM here. Now this video is very ambitious. I'm trying to make a corporate charter, so to speak, for a new kind of NATO that will be far more effective at defending democracy, freedom and egalitarianism than the current NATO that doesn't even have that in their mission statement. The current NATO is actually a dead organization. It doesn't function anymore. It was fine when it was created just after Second World War, when United States was 50% of the global economy and 80% of all military power. So to create an organization with United States in it would basically mean, okay, it's protected by United States and every other country in that membership organization doesn't really matter. But United States is no longer as strong as they used to be. I have made a table with all the military might of every country that has some military might, and United States is a far cry from what they used to be. So we need another NATO where we can be more members instead of just the North Atlantic members. And we also need a NATO where every decision that NATO makes cannot be vetoed by the smallest country in the world, like we have seen from Hungary vetoing any aid packages to Ukraine. We have seen that Turkey has vetoed membership of Finland and Sweden, and it took 2 years before Turkey finally gave in and accepted it, only because they were forced by the United States to do it. They didn't do it voluntarily. Now, another problem with NATO is that it doesn't require countries to spend a certain minimum on their military spending. There are some countries that doesn't spend anything on the military and they're still members, like Iceland. They don't have a military, they have a coast guard. And United States is spending 3.5%. Every other country in NATO spent less, apart from Poland that spends more than that. So we need new rules with minimum requirements for how much military spending there should be. Another problem with the current NATO is that it doesn't deal with supply chains and military technology. So we need a new organization that actually describes how to defend supply chains and also technology that can be used militarily to have the superior advantage if a prolonged global war breaks out with conventional weapons, because nobody will use nuclear weapons. Just like nobody have used chemical weapons and biological weapons, because there are only losers to that. But we could still have a third world war that's not fought with any nuclear weapons but with conventional weapons. And we need to be able to win such a war. And we cannot win that if we don't have the best technology and we cannot defend our supply chains. So we need a NATO that specifically has rules for how to secure supply chains and technology. Another area where NATO totally fails is how to fight the war that is fought against democracies in the media, also social media, where our enemies are paying people to spread false stories that are undermining our democracies. And they also use AI technology with AI bots that are pretending to be humans and that are spreading all kind of propaganda from our enemies. We need a NATO that can combat that threat, which is real and in full effect, and we have nothing in NATO that can defend against that. So that's another reason why we need to tear down the current NATO and build up a new organization that can deal with that kind of problems. And one of the final things I'd mention that NATO doesn't have but should have is a clear strategy for how to promote freedom, egalitarianism and democracy in non-member countries of this new organization that will be all about that. How can democracies have a policy that promote or incentivizes these authoritarian countries to become more like us with freedom, egalitarianism and democracy, so that they no longer poses a threat to us militarily? Because it's simply a fact that democratic countries are not a threat to other countries militarily. We play by better rules, we have ethics and better moral than authoritarian states that are savages that simply will invade other countries for money and for more power over people. In some of my videos I got some critique that I branded some people as good and others as bad guys, and that made me think about what do I actually mean with that. Well, I do brand people as good and bad guys, and the good guys are those who fight for democracy, egalitarianism and freedom. And the bad guys are those who want authoritarian state, who doesn't want egalitarianism, who doesn't want democracy. That's the bad guys. And it's very clear to see who they are. It's China, Russia, Iran, it's all the Islamist Now, the reason I'm making this video is that I can see that democracies all over the world are under attack. We are being attacked by our enemies through propaganda campaigns in media, both conventional media and social media. We are being attacked militarily in Ukraine. China is threatening to attack Taiwan, also a democracy. And you can see Israel has been attacked by the Islamists, and Israel is also a democracy that's being attacked. Yemen is attacking international shipping. All the authoritarian countries are attacking us, and we don't have an effective defense against it. And that's why I wanted to make this video. How can we create an effective organization that can actually protect the free world against these authoritarian regimes? Because if we don't get a replacement for NATO that's far more effective, then we are going to lose. That's my prediction. We have to adapt and change to this world we're living in. Otherwise, we will lose. And that is the thing I'm addressing in this video. If you think that sounds interesting, keep watching. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the many new subscribers I got since my last video, and also I urge non-subscribers to get subscribed and also to like my video. You can always unsubscribe if you don't like my channel. I need to get to 100,000 subscribers in order to make a decent living of this, so help me do that. Now, those who have followed my channel and have seen many more of my videos know that I like to organize stuff in spreadsheets because it's just a better way to get information organized and also to systematically work on that information to improve it over time. Making a charter for far more effective NATO is no exception. So the spreadsheet you are looking at here is that charter, and I have a name for this organization that's supposed to be a better, stronger NATO. And I have called it here the Global Defense Alliance for Freedom, Egalitarianism and Democracy. It's a better name than NATO because NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, treaty organization can be anything. It doesn't really say anything about what that organization is about. And North Atlantic, that's another error of NATO. It shouldn't have been North Atlantic, it should be global. But I do admit that NATO is a better acronym than GDaFed. That doesn't quite sound as great, but maybe if you keep repeating it, it will sound great over time. It has actually grown on me. I find it better the more I've thought about that name, GDaFed here. But the Global Defense Alliance for Freedom, Egalitarianism and Democracy, it has in that name that it's global, which is super important, and it has in the name what this organization is about. It's about defending freedom, egalitarianism, and democracy. NATO doesn't have such a mission statement. Now, the closest thing there is to a mission statement in NATO is NATO's famous Article 5. And what is Article 5? Well, Article 5 in NATO require NATO countries to assist if another NATO country is a victim of an armed attack. It doesn't really say anything more than that. They have to assist. They don't say if assistance has to be military or financial. It doesn't say anything about how much that you should assist with. So you could in principle fulfill Article 5 if you just donate $1 to a member country that has been attacked. That means it's total vaporware. There's nothing in it. It creates an illusion about an organization that will defend other countries, but in reality there's no obligation to defend other countries in any meaningful way. So what is my suggestion for fixing the vaporware of Article 5 in NATO? Well, I have this Chapter 1 mission statement of GDaFed. All GDaFed members are required to defend the territories of all other members. And then if you click the next cell, you can get a further explanation, and that explanation say that you can get even further explanation down in Chapter 4 of this charter. Let's go down to Chapter 4 right away. Here it says GDaFed members are required to offer military help in case of an attack. So they have to offer military help now. If a GDaFed member country is a victim of an armed attack, other members are required to assist militarily. The level of military assistance from any member state should be approximately the following. 1. With regard to the needed troops to deal with this problem, each member country send a number of troops in proportion to their own population as a fraction of the total population of all GDaFed members. So that means there's an exact number of how many troops that each country should send to deal with this crisis. And also, with regard to military equipment and ammunition needed to deal with this armed attack, each GDaFed member contribute in proportion to the size of the GDP relative to the total GDP of all GDaFed countries. Now we fix this. And number 2 rule is that GDaFed members are also required to offer financial help in the case of an attack. The thing is, you don't only need military help, troops and equipment and stuff, you also need financial help. We can see it in Ukraine, where Ukraine has been attacked and the whole country's economy is paralyzed, so they don't really have money to pay public employees or even their army. So where do they get some money from? Well, currently they get a lot of aid from other countries that are sending financial assistance to Ukraine so they can keep their economy going. And here, other GDaFed members are also obligated to aid financially to deal with this attack. And each member are required to send aid in accordance to their own share of the GDP of all GDaFed members. So again, it's very concrete, it's very doable, and this Article 5 here has been fixed completely. Now, in an organizational charter, you also need to specify what happens if some rules are broken. There needs to be some penalties for that, of course. Otherwise, you don't have an incentive to actually follow the rules. So what will happen here is that a failure to provide required assistance will result in expulsion from GDaFed. So you're kicked out of the organization if you don't contribute as you promised when you joined the organization. And then again, there has to be some flexibility in this, so there also need to be a way to make an exception from these rules. And any exceptions from Chapter 4 rules need to get an approval by 2/3 of the member countries' votes. So that's how we could fix Article 5 of NATO with these new rules that are far more concrete and no longer vaporware. So what other mission statements should we have in this GDaFed to make it a stronger form of NATO? Well, we should have this mission statement number 2 that says that GDaFed members are required to maintain and protect a high level of FED. And FED is short for freedom, egalitarianism, and democracy. And if I click the next cell here, we can get a little more elaboration about what I mean by this. Freedom, egalitarianism, and democracy are considered basic human rights or values that are shared across all member states and that are worth fighting and dying for. Freedom, egalitarianism, and democracy is the ethical and moral glue of the alliance that justifies ordering soldiers to, if need be, give their lives for the protection of the territories of any other membership country. You need to have some pretty good reasons to order people to their death if need be, and these reasons are the fight for these shared values. Also, it says here that GDaFed members are required at all times to maintain and protect a high level of freedom, egalitarianism, and democracy. A failure to do so will result in expulsion from GDaFed. For specific, see Chapter 5. And I have here down in Chapter 5, I have described how to maintain and also protect a high level of individual freedom, a high level of egalitarianism, and a high level of democracy. Now, this is a big topic, and I have quite a lot to say here. If you click these individual cells, you can see that I have written quite a lot of text there. So what I've decided with this video is that I'll postpone that to a forthcoming video in order to make this video shorter so you can get the full picture in this video, and then I'm going deeper into some specifics in some forthcoming videos. So I'll just leave it at that. But there is one thing I want to say about this mission statement number 2, and that is what kind of NATO problem that this GDaFed rule is solving. And you can find out what is solved here by clicking this cell here and then read from what I've written in this cell. So NATO does not have a purpose that is worth fighting and dying for. That makes NATO unstable, fragmented, and destined for failure. That's my opinion. Most wars have been about fighting and dying for country, king, queen, or for a religion as a main motivation. NATO is an alliance of different countries with very different cultures, so it's not reasonable that anyone want to fight and die for another NATO country with different culture and religion. The only glue that will hold GDaFed together is the shared belief in the good of maintaining a high level of freedom, egalitarianism, and democracy. The belief in these three principles for good is so important that they are explicitly stated in the name of GDaFed so that nobody ever forgets about it. This is what holds us together. This is what's worth dying for. That's our, you could say, religion, but it's not a religion. It's just some universal principles for what is good. And I think that's super important. So let's move to the third mission statement for GDaFed. What does it say? It's up here. GDaFed members are required to internalize key supply chains and technology. And if we click the next cell here, we get an elaboration of what that means. And it says here, superior military power depend on having the best technology and also on having supply chains that can be defended and maintained in a situation of war, even if that war takes many years to complete, like we saw in the Second World War. This is why it's important that supply chains and technology are internalized to include only GDaFed members. In other words, this means important supply chains and technology must either be homemade in that country or it must be imported from other GDaFed members. For specifics about how to internalize supply chains and tech, see chapter 6, 7 and 8. So let's move down to chapter 6 and see what's that about. So chapter 6 is about military spending and procurement of arms. The first obvious rule for GDaFed members is that procurement of arms has to be done from other GDaFed members or from your own military industry. You are not allowed to buy any arms from outside of GDaFed countries. NATO today doesn't have such a rule, and that's why some countries like Turkey are buying weapons from our arch enemy, Russia. That's just insane and obviously not a good way to have a strong military power for defending anything. If you're buying weapons and are depending on weapons from your most likely enemy to invade your own country, that's just completely idiotic, and GDaFed will fix that problem for NATO. Another problem that NATO needs to get fixed is, of course, that it's completely not right that some countries are spending far more on military expenses than other countries, relatively speaking. United States are spending 3.5% of their GDP on military spending, while other countries are not spending anything at all, like Iceland. They have no military at all. They only have a coast guard. In fact, every other member country are spending less than United States in terms of percentage of GDP, apart from Poland that are spending more than United States. But of course, GDaFed should have a rule that every country are required to spend a certain minimum percentage of their GDP on military expenses. I have it down here in these rules. And to make a change from previous years on military spending, you need 2/3 of the votes to approve any changes of that. I'd imagine that in peacetime, you'd have that everybody should spend, as United States does, 3.5% of their GDP on military spending, and that's a minimum requirement. Any country can spend more than that if they wish to. Now, Chapter 6 also has a rule for exceptions to the rules in Chapter 6. And if 2/3 of the votes are approving such an exception, well, then it's allowed. And another thing is, what if you are in non-compliance with military spending? Well, then you are put in for a vote of being expelled from GDaFed. And if 80% of the votes approve that you are expelled, then you'll just be kicked out of GDaFed. And that will have a lot of consequences. One of the consequences is that if you have any military industry that export arms to other countries, then that arms export will be terminated immediately. But it's far worse than that, and we know that from Chapter 7, which is about internalizing important supply chains to GDaFed members. There's a long range of industries that has to be internalized because of the need for having a strong military alliance that can fight wars that are multi-year long and that are global, and where all these supply chains has to be protected. And I will make a separate video about that, how all these supply chains can be protected and what they will involve and what the rules are for that. But as you can see, I have quite a lot of rules down here. Basically, if you are kicked out of GDaFed, most countries will have their economy ruined because they are cut off from exporting to other GDaFed countries in these areas that are internalized. And that means there's a really good incentive both to join the alliance and for not being kicked out of the alliance, because you will get access to a lot of markets by joining the alliance, and you will be kicked out of a lot of markets globally if you are kicked out of the alliance. You have to think about incentive. NATO doesn't have any rules for supply chains that are internalized, and therefore there's really no incentives to join NATO other than have a common defense. Here there will be a strong economic incentive to join the alliance and a strong economic incentive not to be kicked out of the alliance. But actually, the incentive to become a member of GDaFed and the incentive not to be kicked out of GDaFed is even stronger, because there's also here in Chapter 8 restrictions on export of sensitive technology. Now, I have only mentioned 2 types of sensitive technology that I can come up with right now, and that is all AI chips for training is banned for export to non-GDaFed members, and also all chips for war drones are banned for export to non-GDaFed members. There will be many more technologies that will be banned for export to non-GDaFed members that are important for keeping military superiority of this alliance compared to the enemies of GDaFed. But this is a work in progress. As time goes by, I'll update this charter with more rules. That's just how it is. You can't get all your ideas at once. You have to work on such a document over a long time to make it better. And that's how I do for all my spreadsheets here. I continue to work on them to get them better over time. So this AI chips here, they are important to grow your economy in the future, because AI will be enormously important for having a high wealth level in your economy, because these AI chips will control robots that produces pretty much everything. So if you don't have access to this technology, your whole economy will tank. So there are really strong economic incentives and also strong military incentives to join the alliance, and equally strong incentives not to be kicked out of the alliance, meaning that you have a strong incentive to respect the rules of GDaFed. But I think that will finish it all for the 3rd mission statement of GDaFed, that was about GDaFed members are required to internalize key supply chains and technology. Now we just need the 4th mission statement, which is about GDaFed members are required to promote FED principles for non-members. And what does that more specifically mean? Well, we can see that by clicking the next cell here. GDaFed members should actively promote FED principles outside their own territory, as countries that have higher standards for FED obviously are less of a military threat to GDaFed members. The best way to win a war is not to start a war to begin with. And that's why you should have an active strategy for making the countries outside of GDaFed less of a threat to GDaFed, less likely to invade. What I've said here is that authoritarian regimes are predatories by nature. Their system prey on their own people, and they will also find it more natural to prey on their neighbor countries by invading them and assimilating them, and then start utilizing the resources in those countries. A good example of that is Russia. Their whole foreign policy is based on we don't have any fixed borders. We try to expand wherever we can to assimilate more resources and people that we can prey on in this kleptocracy of a system they have that basically funnel up resources and power to the top of this society and exploits everybody else. That's not a good society to have. We should have societies that are more egalitarian, everybody equal to the law, no discrimination. We have democracy, a legitimate way of picking our leaders, and we have freedom of speech, freedom to live our lives as we please, find the partner in life we want to be with, freedom to pick your job that you want to work with, freedom to pick your education, etc., etc. Promoting FED globally is also a method for gaining strength over time, as new countries will become suited for membership of GDaFed. And then for specifics about how to promote FED principles, see Chapter 9. So let's scroll down this list here to see what I have under Chapter 9. So Chapter 9 has the title, Unilateral Foreign Aid Must Be Conditional on Progress Towards FED Principles. Obviously, the major instrument we can have to affect the behavior of non-members of GDaFed is our unilateral foreign aid. We are donating about 1% of GDP to other countries today, but instead of just donating them without requiring anything, in the future, because of GDaFed rules, there should be some conditions that needs to be fulfilled if you want foreign aid from us. One thing is that foreign aid should be conditional on a minimum level of FED practices. And we can see these principles that needs to be fulfilled by clicking the next cell here. It says that no GDaFed member is allowed to fund unilateral foreign aid to countries who 1. Ban education for parts of the population. Females, for instance, are barred from education in many Islamist countries. 2. Criminalize people for being LGBT Again, some Islamist countries like Iran have death penalty for being an LGBT person, and other countries like Russia have imprisonment and fines for being an LGBT person. And then free countries that are allowing underage marriage, that is child brides, and that again is normal in some Islamist countries. It's basically institutionalizing pedophilia and child abuse. And of course, we cannot support countries who does that. It should be beyond us. As time passes, I will expand this list of things that should get you banned from receiving any foreign aid. But again, as I've said here, all my work on these spreadsheets is a work in progress. And as I get more ideas over time, I will add them to my spreadsheets. And also I get some of these ideas from the comment section. So if you have a good idea for what should be in this list, put it in the comment section and I'll update my spreadsheet. So what else do I have under Chapter 9 that I've thought about? Well, there should be a rule here that says that no foreign aid to countries that have gone backwards on FED principles. For instance, when Afghanistan was taken over by the Taliban, everything went backwards. When stuff like that happens, the GDaFed countries should simply cut all aid to these countries and say you can't have it unless you go back to at least the same level you were previously. Then your aid will come back. Countries have to demonstrate a continuous progress in FED principles, otherwise the aid will simply go away. And that's how we will incentivize countries to become less dangerous to GDaFed countries over time. There should be some exceptions from these principles about not giving foreign aid to certain countries. One example here is natural disaster help. If there's an earthquake or tsunami or something, yes, then we, for humanitarian reasons, can provide some temporary help to ease the pain of that. And also medical help needed to combat pandemics that are a threat to the whole world. Yes, here we can also make an exception and go in and support vaccination programs and so forth. And what else? Then I have the standard things here. Any changes to foreign aid rules here in Chapter 9, they will require an 80% majority for approval. And also any exceptions from foreign aid rules, they'll need 2/3 majority rule. So that pretty much covers it for Chapter 9 here. And it also covers it with regard to the mission statements we had in Chapter 1, because it was the last of the 4 mission statements we have here. But there are still a few chapters that we haven't covered that is part of this charter for GDaFed. One is Chapter 2 about voting rules for GDaFed. And it's very simple. It will not be one member, one vote, and also veto right for each member as we have in NATO. No, now it will be voting rights for each country is assigned in proportion to their military spending in US dollars relative to how much that spending is for all of GDaFed members. I have made a spreadsheet where I've calculated exactly how many votes will each country get for a certain list of members, and I'll get back to that shortly. But I want to tell you a little bit about what kind of problems that this new way of voting in GDaFed will solve for NATO. The problem is described if you click this cell here. And what can we read in this cell? Well, NATO has become dysfunctional because all decisions have to be unanimous, meaning that every country has a veto right to block every decision NATO makes. All it takes for an enemy country of NATO to make NATO dysfunctional is to control the head of state in one member country using one or more of the following classic Secret Service method. And now I'll give you some Secret Service methods that are absolutely used by the enemies of NATO and the enemies of freedom, democracy, and egalitarianism. And the first method is find one head of state that is corrupt and who take bribes either directly or indirectly by supporting head of state's political party or manipulation public opinion using massive numbers of fake social media accounts that uses AI chatbots to sway voters for the party of the head of state. And the second method is find one head of state and compromise person by acquiring incriminating evidence and use that to blackmail that person. Several methods can be used to obtain incriminating evidence for blackmail. A. Spying to obtain documentation for criminal activity. B. If head of state is, say, a pedophile, then hook that person up with a child prostitute and film it all in a hotel room. Or C here, obtain other compromising evidence on head of state that might not be a criminal offense, but if revealed, it would still make that state of head lose the next election. And some current head of states in NATO countries actually behave as if they were compromised by our enemies. One example is Hungary, that seems to do everything Russia wants them to do. I'm pretty sure they're compromised somehow. But there are other examples of how NATO's decision-making process has made NATO dysfunctional. It doesn't need to be compromising a head of state. It can also be simply a country blocking things that shouldn't be blocked, like Turkey, who blocked the membership of Finland and Sweden for 2 whole years. That should have taken like 2 weeks to make them members, not 2 years. That's just the examples of how we could fix all these imperfections of NATO simply by voting according to how much military spending you have. But let's move on and see some of the other rules that are here. A change of rules in GDaFed will require 80% of the votes in favor. So you can change any rule in GDaFed as long as you get 80% of the votes. And also chapter 3 here about entry, exit, expulsion and exceptions. Well, it says here in chapter 3 that the alliance is a global alliance. Any country with a high level of FED principles are welcome. And also entry can be approved by 2/3 of the votes. Exit can be done at any time. You are free to leave the organization at any time, but of course it will have consequences. You will be barred from exporting a lot of things without any tariffs to other GDaFed members. You will also be barred from technology imports to your own country if you do that. So there will be these consequences, but it is voluntarily to be a member of GDaFed, as it should be for any international organization. Also, expulsion here for GDaFed members can happen if 80% are in favor. So if you are breaking the rules of GDaFed, it would be natural to put a vote up for expulsion of your country so you are kicked out of GDaFed. But because it has really serious consequences for that country to be kicked out, it should require 80% of the votes in favor of that. And what else? Exceptions from GDaFed rules in general can be approved by 2/3 of the members voting in favor. That pretty much covers it with all the chapters I've so far found out that should be part of the corporate charter for the GDaFed organization. Now let's go to the spreadsheet I've made for which countries I imagine would be members of such an organization. So this is a table I have made for the likely members of GDaFed that have high enough standards for freedom, democracy and egalitarianism to qualify for GDaFed membership. From North America, I imagine that United States, obviously, Canada and also Mexico should be members of GDaFed. From South America, I can only find Argentina that I know of. That's because I'm not knowledgeable enough about all the countries in South America. I'm sure there are more countries than that, but I just don't know about them. You can put in the notes below the video if you think some other countries should qualify as being democratic enough to be part of GDaFed membership. Also from Europe, I know a lot about Europe because I'm from Europe. I think there are 35 countries that qualify currently for membership of GDaFed. And these countries are Germany, UK, France, Italy, Spain, Netherlands, Switzerland, Poland, Belgium, Sweden, Norway, Ireland, Austria, Denmark, Portugal, Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Finland, Iceland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Greece, Slovenia, Croatia, Albania, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Luxembourg, Cyprus, Malta, and Hungary. These are the countries I imagine should be part of GDaFed from the get-go. And also from the Middle East, I have only one country there, that would be Israel. Some might think that's controversial, but it really isn't if you think about it. Israel is a democracy. They have a democratic elected government. They respect principles for FED very much so. Unlike in Gaza, where Hamas rules, where they have child brides and where they discriminate big time against LGBT people and so forth. Also another reason that Israel must be a member of GDaFed, apart from it qualifies on FED principles, is that Israel produces some of the best weapons in the world, and we need Israeli weapons in order to defend ourselves effectively. I know a lot about weapons. I didn't used to know a lot about weapons, but then I started making videos here about Ukraine, and I started to gather information about weapon systems, and I have it also in this table here, this spreadsheet here. I have all the weapons in the world, hundreds of them, and I have listed them with specifications, how much they cost and so forth. So I know a lot about weapons, and that's also why I know that Israel is one of the key producers of weapons, and we absolutely need their weapons in order to effectively defend ourselves. Especially their rocket technology is superior and also better than many of the rocket systems that the United States have developed. Anyway, that was about that. And from Asia, we should have Japan, South Korea, Australia, Taiwan, Singapore, and New Zealand as members of GDaFed. Now, I do have a little objection about Taiwan. Taiwan is in a legal limbo currently, and they need to solve that limbo status about what they are. Currently, Taiwan thinks they are the legitimate China, although they are only a small fraction of all of China. They still claim to be the legitimate China, which is absurd. Of course, mainland China is the legitimate China, and if they want to be a member of GDaFed, they should have a referendum and declare independence and then get a new name like Taiwan and not have anything about China in that name in order not to infringe on China's rightful title to that name. Otherwise, well, this is the members of GDaFed as I imagine they will be. And I've also listed in this table, as you can see it continues down here, I've also listed the enemy countries that are either attacking, threatening or intimidating GDaFed member countries. And these are, of course, Russia and also Iran and North Korea, China, because they are intimidating Taiwan, which is a democratic country. Turkey, they are an enemy of Greece, Cyprus, and also Israel. And they are becoming more and more Islamist and authoritarian. They are an enemy of GDaFed and of GDaFed principles. And that's why they're listed down here, and they're definitely not going to be a member of GDaFed. But they are a member of NATO today, which is grotesque given how they treat their own population. And also Iraq, Qatar, Cuba, Venezuela, Belarus, Burma, Afghanistan, Syria, and Yemen all are enemies that are threatening the free world. And then I have some other countries that are not really enemies of GDaFed, but they are also not free, egalitarian, or democratic enough to qualify for GDaFed membership. And here I've just mentioned India, Brazil, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Philippines, South Africa, Pakistan, Egypt, Serbia, Jordan, Georgia, Lebanon, and Moldova. I have various reasons for putting them down here in this list, but the big picture you should understand is that all these countries I've listed here, they represent 73% of the global population of countries. I can tell you up here there are 193 countries in the world, and all the countries I have listed in this table are 73 countries, and they represent those 73% of the global population. They represent 91% of the global GDP. They represent 92% of global electricity production, and they represent 99% of all military expenses in the world. Now, this is important because GDaFed is a military organization, so I want to know those countries that have military might. That's relevant to know. And I've also made another table here with key armies. It's exactly the same list of countries as I've mentioned in this list for GDaFed members and enemies of GDaFed and other countries. I have just organized it differently around some key conflicts in the world. For instance, here I organize the countries around the active war that is between Russia and Ukraine. And the second likely war, I said, is a conflict here between China that threatens to invade Taiwan. A third likely war is North Korea threatening to destroy South Korea. And we have a fourth active war here between Iran, Turkey, Islamist proxies trying to destroy Israel. Again, a democratic country that authoritarian states are trying to destroy. And then we have Yemen, where the Houthis are attacking international shipping and also trying to destroy Israel. And what's special about this table is that I've listed not only the military spending, how many troops they have, but also how many military aircraft they have, what type of military aircraft, tanks, artillery system, and so forth. So you have the complete picture in this table here about military strength for 99% of the world's armies in the world. I thought I should mention that. But let's go back to the GDaFed member countries here. I have a few more things I'd like to say about the things you can see in this table here for GDaFed members. One is the current military spending in billion US dollars. You can read that in this column here. And you can see that United States currently spent $900 billion, and that's 36% of the global military spending, because that's in the next column. And it's also 3.5% of the United States gross domestic product. Those 3.5% is more than any other NATO country apart from Poland that spends 4.7% of their GDP, but every other NATO country spent less. And that is, of course, not fair. We should have a minimum percentage that all countries that are members of GDaFed will have to spend. And I imagine it should be the same as for United States, 3.5%. And then I've calculated how will the votes in GDaFed be distributed, because they are distributed according to how much you spend. And I calculated that for current military spending, how would the votes be divided then? And then I've also calculated how would it be divided, the votes, if everybody spends 3.5% of their GDP on military expenses. We can see here how the votes would be distributed in GDaFed if they spent the current military spending. And here we could see that United States would actually have 54% of all the votes. But if every country spent exactly 3.5% of their GDP, well, then the United States would sit with about 41% of all the votes in GDaFed. That also means that they can actually veto a lot of decisions in GDaFed, because in order, for instance, to kick a country out of the organization, you need 80% of the votes of that in favor. So if United States vote against that, well, that's 40% against it, and that means only a maximum of 60% can vote in favor of it. But you can also see that there are no other countries that has a veto right. A veto right will basically mean that you have more than 20% of the votes, but United States is the only country that has more than that in votes. One country that comes close is Japan. They have 7% of the votes. And another country here is Germany. They also have 7% of the votes in this GDaFed organization. But of course, some countries could go together and then get over those 20%. That would be enough to veto the expulsion of a country from GDaFed. But as I've mentioned, there are other limits to how you vote in GDaFed. For instance, if you want to change a rule, that's also 80%. But if you want to have an exception from a rule, that would be 2/3 of the votes. So in order to veto that, you need 34% of the votes. So that's just something I wanted to mention. Otherwise, it's a very informative table I have listed here with the mentioned countries. If it has a D, it means it's a democracy. If it has a N, it means it's a current member of NATO. If it has an A, it means it's an authoritarian country. If it has an AK, it means it's an authoritarian kleptocracy. And a kleptocracy is a country that exploits people by funneling money up to people higher up in the system. Russia is an example of that. I would say China is not a kleptocracy. It's just an authoritarian state. China, they actually have a principle for doing what's good for society, not what's good for the individual. So that's directly against a kleptonian principle where you just do what's good for you. And if you are the authoritarian ruler, you just do what's good for you, and your authoritarian rule, you don't do anything good for anybody else. At least China is morally above that. They're just an authoritarian state. But otherwise, I could also mention one more thing. If there's an E, for instance, Germany has both D for democracy, N for NATO, and it has E for its member of the European Union. Now, this is all I had for this video. It has been a long video. I apologize for that. I couldn't have made it any shorter, but I hope you liked it. I hope you thought it was an important video that I make, because we have to do something about democracies all over the world being targeted now by authoritarian rulers because they no longer fear United States that has fallen in military might and power. Just the word from United States can no longer deter these countries. We need something that's far more effective to deter authoritarian rules from basically conquering and invading democratic countries. That's why we need GDaFed, and that's why I thought this video is extremely important to make. We need somebody to think out what we can do better and how we can start defending ourselves effectively, and I believe GDaFed is that organization. I hope you think that I've gotten some ideas right. I might have gotten some ideas wrong. Tell me about it in the comments section. Also, if I need to add stuff to this charter, tell me about it in the comments section. And also, if you don't have anything to say, at least support my channel by giving it a like. Very important that you subscribe. And if you can afford it, also give me a donation, because my channel is not big enough for me currently so that I can actually live off it. But I'd like to live off being a YouTuber so I can spend all my time doing this kind of videos. I think that's more important than anything else that I can do with my time. So help me make a living out of this by supporting my channel. Otherwise, I just want to say Happy New Year and have a great life in democracy and freedom. Goodbye.